innovative. And the one thing that this woman, who was the brother of the treasurer of a competing oil industry, stood to lose their family fortune, I'm guessing, if Rockefeller succeeded. The one thing that she popularized, which is what your dad would refer to in this conversation, the one thing she popularized was, tell me if this makes sense, is this idea that, you see, Rockefeller had so much money that he could artificially lower the cost of what he was selling to the point where all of his competitors were driven out of business, and then he could jack up the prices enormously after they were driven out of business, right?
Yep, that's exactly what he said.
Yeah, economists don't believe this at all. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. This idea of predatory pricing and so on, no empirical validity. It has never, ever been demonstrated in the entire history of economics that a monopoly has ever been created in that way. And it was never a tactic that was used by Standard Oil, which was never a monopoly anyway. Now, the most they got was in the mid 80% dominance of the industry, which is huge, right? But I mean, that was Microsoft with PCs relative to Apple and all. So they got into the mid 80s. Now, by the time the government started investigating them for supposedly being a monopoly, I mean, his business practices had spread throughout the industry and so on. So he was losing market share enormously. So from the mid 80s, he'd gone down to only the mid 60s in terms of his dominance of the oil industry. And so whatever monopoly there was, because he was kind of first to market with these innovations, they were then copied. I mean, you can't patent vertical integration or anything like that. So he was already losing whatever supposed monopoly he had, which is relatively temporary because he was so innovative. So the market was solving it already when the government came trundling along. And so, regarding this, and I've heard this a million times, well, you have so much money, you're going to lower your prices, drive everyone out of business, then jack this stuff up. That is, it doesn't take a lot of thought. And this is sort of my concern about your dad and this sort of propaganda, right?
Right.
It doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that this is a very, very risky business strategy, right? Because if you're going to, if you're dominant in the market to the point where you supposedly have all of this magic money, let's say you have 80% or 80, I think they had a high of 88% or so in 1890. And then it went down to 64% by 1911. So if you're selling 88% of the oil and then you sell below market price to, quote, drive out competitors, you are losing a crap ton of money because you're selling the most oil. So if you're selling below market, you're losing, like in real terms, more money than your competitors, right? And how long is this supposed to take? How long does it take to drive other people out of business? See, if you're a competitor to somebody who's selling below market to drive you out of business, you can say that to your investors. Listen, Rockefeller's crazy. He's losing, X amount of money on every barrel of oil he sells. He can't keep it up forever. We just have to hang tight. He's destroying his capital reserves. He's going to have less money for R&D, less money for expansion, less money for improvement, less money to pay quality employees. We're going to be able to poach them very easily. All you have to do is give us some money and wait for him to self-destruct. Because how long does it take to drive all of your competitors out of business by undercutting them? Is it a decade? Is it 20 years? Maybe,
well,
maybe for some profit down the road, because let's say you do drive a bunch of people out of business because you're willing to lose money for 20 years or whatever. What about people overseas? They can ship oil to your, what about Canada? What about Mexico? They can ship oil. And what can you do about it? I mean, so it doesn't work. There's no history of it working. Standard Oil never did it. And there's no example that I'm aware of in economics that says this ever works. It was a story told by the sister of the guy who was going to lose millions if Rockefeller succeeded, but it's not a valid concept in economics.
Well, I guess most people that believe this sort of thing believe that it takes a lot longer than 10 years, probably a year or less, to drive somebody out of business using those tactics. But I guess in order for that to work, they'd have to be, the business that would be, or the businesses that would lose out would have to be, would have to have tiny, tiny profit margins for them to go under that quickly.
Right. And you would be losing more money than them. If you've got 88% of the market and you're selling way below cost, and why would you? You've already got 88% of the market. Why would you want to risk that in order to get another couple of percentage points?
Right. Well, they would argue that that's how he got 88% to begin with.
Except it's not, because there's no evidence that he ever sold below cost. There's no evidence that he ever sold below cost. Now, he sold below his competitors' cost. Now, those competitors, like the people who were losing out to this guy, I mean, good Lord. I mean, think of the Democrats last November, right? They had a 30-year experienced politician lose out to a guy who'd never run for office before. Now, did they say, wow, we really misread things, we really misjudged things, we must be so out of touch with the American population, we better rejig things and fire things up again and maybe get some people, some changes at the top of the... No, what did they do? The Russians hacked the election. They didn't tell the truth about why they lost. They made up all this conspiracy theories. Now, if you're a losing company, if you're the head of a losing company, a company that's losing out to Rockefeller, to Standard Oil, are you going to go to your shareholders and say, I'm incompetent, I'm an idiot, I'm not doing all the stuff that Rockefeller's doing, you should sell my shares and go and buy his shares, or you should at least fire me, for heaven's sakes, and maybe sue me for fiduciary misconduct for not doing obvious things to protect the value of your investment? No, he's not going to go to there. He's going to pull a Democrat party and he's going to blame everyone but himself. And, they're undercutting us. They've got this war chest. The reason why they're able to charge less than us is because they're selling at a loss, but they're not telling anyone. That's the kind of bullshit you're going to make up, right? You're not going to say, well, the reason he can sell less than us is because while I was courting all these people in Washington and I was having wonderful quail shoots in the marshes and I was going on sail around the world trips with all of your shareholder money, while I was doing all this crap, he was figuring out how to turn whale oil into cell phones, or I don't know what, like how to turn waste byproducts into Russian brides or something, right?
Right. Oh, real quick, by the way, the coal that you'd mentioned earlier, that was also that is also very frequently given as an example of monopolies that existed without the intervention of government.
But what do they mean by monopolies? If
monopolies?
No, but sorry, what I mean is, if it is a monopoly because everyone else is selling oil for 2 cents, but he's selling it for half a cent, so everybody wants to buy from him, is that a monopoly? What does that even mean?
Well, in this particular sense, it's not necessarily that one, for example, one coal mine has a monopoly and sells to everybody in that sense. It's more that they have a monopoly on employees, where if you live in this town, for example, you've got really not much choice but to work for the coal mine. You don't have much of a choice. You don't have a choice to move somewhere else and get another job per se. They've got like, for example, the song, St. Peter, don't you call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store, because the coal mines, well, at least this is what we're told, would basically be self-sufficient for the company, but they would provide everything to their employees, like, for example, food, clothing and such, but they'd still have to pay for everything. So they had to get but they had a monopoly on all of that. So they had to get their livelihood or their everyday needs through the company that they worked for.
Sure. No, I get it. If you go to an all-inclusive resort, or you go to a resort not an all-inclusive, if you go to some resort and it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, you kind of have to eat at their restaurants, right? Right. They have a monopoly on food. Those evil robber baron bastards with tanning oil. Right? So what? So I don't understand. I mean, why not? You can open up a competing store, indebted. Right?
Well, supposedly these people would become indebted to the company, so that they couldn't, like, for example, the line in the song that says, I owe my soul to the company store,
I don't know if we want to base economic theories on folk songs written by communists. Right. I mean, come on.
Right, but of course but that's where the song supposedly came from.
Yeah, but look, I mean, if let's just, sorry to interrupt, but let's say there's some town, right? The town of Bobsville. Right. And Bobsville has a big mine and the store is the company store, right?
Right.
Okay. So if the store is selling stuff for too high a price, then you can just take your home, convert it into a store, and sell stuff for cheaper.
Assuming that you can get the supplies that the company can get.
What do you mean? There's a mail service. What do you mean if you can get the supplies? I mean, you can go and get them. You wheel them in. You can hire people to bring them in.
Assuming that you can do it at the same price that the company can.
Okay, but if you can't, then the company's not ripping anyone off. If you can't sell it for cheaper than the company can, then the company's selling it as cheap as it can be sold.
Right. I guess the argument at that point becomes, well, they're still not paying their employees enough to even be able to pay the cheap prices.
Well, if they're not paying their employees enough to live, then the employees need to go start a store and sell it for cheaper. And if they can't, then it's not an economically viable mine. And therefore, people need to not be at the place where that mine is. They got to move somewhere. They got to go somewhere. This happens all the time. Mines get exhausted and everyone moves away and they move someplace new. You've seen all of these creepy ghost towns of like old mining towns that nobody's lived in for 50 years or 100 years. So if you can't make it economically viable, then you go somewhere else, right?
Right.
Now, it couldn't be that there were alcoholics who drank themselves dry, like who drank the entire store dry and ended up with a bill that they were shocked and appalled about and blamed the company for their own alcoholism, right? That could never possibly. I'm going to write a song about the company store, rip me off. It's like, I don't know. I'd like to see some of the numbers there. I'd like to see what you bought.